coming out on a Sunday evening, or a cold Sunday evening. Do appreciate that. So the talk I was asked to talk about was about science and scientism, or what is scientism and the difference. So I'll focus on that. We got time for Q&A at the end as well. Oh, yeah, but I'm happy to take Q&A on a wide range of areas. I'm a generalist, in the sense of I'm not a deep PhD specialist in one area. I'm broad, wide, etc. So my first degree was minor in engineering, got a master's in logistics, got a master's in business administration, got a degree in theology, got my master's from Biola. I'm a generalist, and so I have interest in a wide range of areas. This is really applicable to business as well. It's applicable to anything general in life, and hopefully at the end you'll think about that, and hopefully I'll get that. Whoops, what's happening here? Why is he not moving? That's not a good start, is it? There we go, it moved. The essence of the talk today is what do we mean by science? A word that's thrown around a lot is science. It's the science. Trust the science. Do you remember that during COVID? Yeah? Trust the modeling. It's the science. You got to believe it. So it's a word, something that's thrown around. It's just the science, and statements like science has proven there's no God. Sometimes people say that. Or we can only know things through science, or I only trust what science can prove. That's I've run a lot of alpha courses over the years. I've heard people say that a number of times over the years. Just believe that. And this is not a science versus Christianity talk. Science is wonderful. Science helps us understand the natural world. And helps us understand God's creation. But often underpinning such statements is actually something quite different to science. It's a philosophical belief called scientism. And so that's what I'm going to try and show today is the difference. Scientism is a philosophical belief that is pretty much the same as materialism, physicalism, philosophical naturalism. These terms all basically point to the same thing. And today we'll try and show, I believe, why scientism is flawed, and hopefully I'll be able to get that across reasonably. This is apologetics. Apologetics is one of those words that can put people off sometimes. People think it's often complicated, detailed stuff by people trying to be clever. Again, being a generalist, I like to try and get at the essence of things. I like to get, there's a big difference between simple and simplistic. But if we can make things simple, I think that's helpful, because it still captures the essence of what's behind it. But apologetics to me is all about what we believe and why we believe it. It's about knowledge, about knowledge claims, what we would claim to know. When somebody says, I know this, I believe this, they're making a claim. And really that's what apologetics is about. And Christian apologetics is applied to the claims of Christianity. And so, the key thing for me is two questions are, what do you believe, what do we believe, and why believe it? Underlying that is about, well, why believe anything? For those of you who've been involved in things like alpha or evangelism, this will be pretty clear to you. Apologetics tends to be thought of dealing with intellectual head stuff. I actually, I won't say you can never, but it's very rare I think someone is argued into faith overall with head stuff. I think apologetics is wonderful at removing barriers that could be there, without a doubt. Often there's many other reasons going in that are the barriers to people coming to faith, and why we believe things. This is scriptural. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's a holistic view there of love, and I believe our beliefs come from holistic things. They come sometimes from our desires. We just want to believe something. I was talking to someone in our church. He's about 60 odd. He's being drawn by quite liberal writings at this stage of his life. He grew up in quite a narrow context, and he's discovered things that over time that have probably rocked that narrow context a bit. and he's been drawn to some things. And he said, I was chatting to him about something, and he said, oh, I'd like, I really like something to be true. And I said, well, that's not a good reason to say it is true. It was a desire. He wanted it to be true. So there's desires. Our feelings sometimes can, play into issues of what we might believe. I'll be controversial in some contexts. I think it's very hard to get to a scriptural endorsement and celebration of same-sex relationships. It's very hard. I would say you've got to so ignore scripture to get there that you're not treating scripture fairly. But I have huge sympathy with, the desire of some people not to want to offend. I don't want to offend anyone, and I get that people don't want to do that. And that desire will sometimes overtake trying to understand, well, why has God, if you believe in God, the creator of this universe, designed the world, the universe for a purpose and humans, why has he said this is what is the best way for humans to flourish? Wrestle with that. And if you wrestle with it beyond the individual case, which, same-sex attraction is very real, it must be very tough, you get beyond that individual case and the genuine compassion you can have, and then look at the flourishing of human society, I think you can start to understand why God may have designed things in a certain way. But I can understand, in some ways, life would be a lot easier. I'll be really controversial. If Jesus had just said, you know what, if two same-sex people really love each other and want to stay in a monogamous relationship, it's all cool. In some ways, life would be much easier. Some of you might be a bit shocked by that, but it would be. But he didn't. And if you accept that he didn't, you then peel it back and try and understand why. But I get the desires. I get the feelings. Desires, feelings, beliefs lead to actions. They lead to habits in life. They impact relationships. So this is not all theoretical stuff. It actually plays out into how we live and how we relate as we move forward. And apologetics is really important for that. In terms of why we believe things, there's relational, emotional reasons. The pressure of culture, parents, friends, peers. You look at the power of that on teenagers, for example. Peer pressure is huge. And so, why we would want to believe something. Desires, wants, fears, revulsion, they all can play into why we might say we believe something overall. And often retorted to Christians sometimes, well, if you'd have been born in Saudi Arabia, you'd have been a Muslim. And there is power to that statement. So there are those cultural, desires, emotional reasons overall. Coming out of that context, even leaving Mormonism in Utah, for example, would be a massive thing to do in your life. And so there are those powerful reasons to say why you might believe something. There's volitional reasons of will, to want something. The want for authority, autonomy, freedom. I want to live as I want to live. I want to be what I want to be. I don't want any rules holding me back. So therefore, I don't want to believe those rules. And then there's the temptations of this world: money, sex, power, pleasure, status. They can all play into us convincing ourselves what we might say we believe, overall. But ultimately, there are evidential reasons, and that's what apologetics tries to focus on. It should understand volitional, relational, emotional reasons because they're incredibly powerful. But we ultimately would, I believe, would come back to evidential reasons if we're really genuinely seeking the truth. And I take an holistic view of evidence, and I'll just unpack this more, that we take evidence from a wide range of types of sources. Science is one of those sources. It produces evidence of the natural world, the physical world. But there's logic. We'll talk a little bit more of that in a minute in terms of deductive reasoning. There's historical evidence. Historical evidence where you get artifacts from the past and you try and make sense of what they're saying. Well, that's quite different to science, isn't it? And we'll look at that a bit more in a minute. There is our personal experience. I would say, you know, and in some ways it's the most powerful reason that I believe. To others it might have the least power. The most powerful reason I believe in God is encountering God's Spirit and the reality of experiencing God, personal experience. Now, for somebody who is perhaps not a Christian, they might be looking at me, and a lot of my friends back in South Wales, because I didn't come to faith till I was about 40, probably go, that's nice for you, Mark. He's lost it, yeah. But it is powerful evidence. See, talking about mining, in 1983, I was crawling into the coalface, very powerful equipment on a 200-meter long coalface. They've got what is called a chain conveyor, and it's meant to be anchored down so that it can't move. When it started up, it wasn't anchored down properly. It swung back and slammed me up against the wall at the side of the tunnel. Basically, you got a 200-ton piece of machinery that slammed me against the wall. People who were there at the time said I was screaming like a pig. Somebody luckily put a button in, you know, that's a safety button, and it stopped and came off. I had 2 punctured lungs, and, you know, afterwards, because I played rugby with some of the guys I was working with, they were saying, well, you were just really screaming. I didn't experience that. What I experienced was floating above myself, very calm, looking down and going, oh, you're going to die now. And it was really calm. Now, is that true? It's personal experience. I know it happened, but there's probably lots of people might explain that away. I hadn't been drinking, yeah. I assure you that. You know, so, you know, I think the personal experience, that personal experience is one of the most powerful evidences for me of a soul, yeah, of a non-physical essence to being human, you know. But others it wouldn't be, yeah. But I do think that we shouldn't discount personal experiences, especially if those personal experiences are then being experienced by many, many others. They're not just unique. And that's why I say experiences, the collective experience of the human condition, of being human overall. And then similarly, you know, slightly different though, is basic intuitions. You know, there's something that Alvin Plantinga calls properly basic beliefs. His argument is that belief in God is a properly basic belief. It doesn't need to be proven. All humans intuitively know it, really, that there is a cause and a design to this universe. Having a soul, I mentioned that earlier, is a properly basic belief in many ways, even though there are arguments I'll come on to later for a soul. I was doing a talk in my church recently, and there's a wonderful woman there, and we were talking about things like this, and I said, well, you know, have we got a soul? And she said, well, of course we have, she said. Of course we have. It's obvious. Now, some people might find that, you know, not great evidence. It's actually very powerful. Virtually everyone in human history would have said that. You know, we use the language of a soul, of an essence, all the time. So there's basic intuitions, and there's revelation. Because if God does exist, is the creator of this universe, we would expect God to have revealed himself in some way. You know? So there's revelation. All of these sources can be tested, and we'll talk a bit more about that. You know? But the argument I would put is that relational reasons, volitional reasons are all powerful. But in some ways, they're not the evidential reasons for what is true overall. They get in the way. They can be very powerful, you know, but I'm going to focus on evidential reasons, and I've grouped them there as well. So, you know, why do we believe things? Why do we reach any conclusions overall? I'll throw a few controversial ones up there to get you thinking, because there's some people who think different things. Did the Holocaust really happen? Yeah? Now, I'm convinced it did happen, but some people argue it didn't. How do you reach a conclusion on that overall? Did we land on the moon? Yeah, there's a growing number of people now who think we didn't land on the moon. It's all a big conspiracy. I remember chatting with an executive in a business I was with once, and he said that, oh, I don't believe we landed on the moon. Should I say this now? I think I will. You know, but what are the evidence? We've got pictures. Well, they could have been faked. We've got lots of eyewitnesses. Well, they could have made it up. It could have been a conspiracy. And he said, well, why would you believe it? I said, well, no wonder when there's all those evidences that you said. But probably the biggest thing is the Russians were watching. At the time, the Russians were watching. If it is reasonable to infer that if the Russians were watching, and the moon isn't that far away, and it was all a fake, the Russians would have made a big stink about it at the time. And would have done to this day. Yeah. And now, it's cumulative, all the pictures, the people who said they were there, everything else. And you get the evidences that people would say it's all a hoax. Well, which hypothesis has the most explanatory power and scope and is the most plausible? You have to weigh them up, and that's where we'll be going. Did COVID come from a lab in Wuhan? I'm deliberately picking controversial issues. Well, in the middle of COVID, in the early days, I think it was 100-odd scientists it was in either the Washington Post or New York Times, took a full-page ad to say that it clearly didn't. It would be racist to believe that. Yeah? I mean, I'm not trying to be clever, but to me, some of the earliest people to die from it had worked in that lab. It was doing gain-of-function work, which is creating things to see, well-meaning, because if you can do gain-of-function work, you can then try and invent a vaccine in advance before something would happen naturally. Yeah. So, but some of the earliest people to die were from there. It was in Wuhan. It's reasonable hypothesis to say it did come there, at the very least. Overall, I think it's now generally accepted that it did, but it's interesting. God told me. This is a church. What do you do with someone when they say, God told me this? Yeah? Do you go, okay, we believe that? Now, most churches I'm involved with, we do believe that God works today. We're not cessationists in the churches I've been involved with. Yeah? God, the Spirit speaks. And we're at Take Whangaparaoa Baptist, we encourage congregational participation in the service. And sometimes you'll get strange words. Yeah? Well, we are very clear. We have protocols for that. We have process. We'll test that. Does it line up with God's revelation and what we know about God's character? How are other people hearing the same thing? Yeah? Now, what's also interesting in a large church, is how some people will start getting the same sense at different times, or can have no connection with each other, overall. But how do you assess that? And then we move on to the main focus today, is it's a science, so it must be true. Just believe the science. In reality, this talk is all about truth, though. It's a particular angle on the question of knowledge, how we know something's true. What's called epistemology. Now, I was on my third degree. This is, I think, quite damning of the education system. I was on my third degree before I even heard the word epistemology. I did a degree in mine engineering. I did a master's in logistics, and I was doing my MBA, which is a Master of Business Administration. And for my MBA, I had to do a dissertation. And the dissertation I wanted to do was to do 3 case studies on 3 places I'd worked. A Walmart in Canada, a British retailer called Tesco, and another British retailer called Iceland. I wanted to do three case studies on the management of change and the leadership of change in each of those contexts. And the professor looked at me and he goes, don't do that. Don't do that. I said, why not? I really want to look at what happened. I want to look at the theory of change. I want to understand what happened and synthesize some knowledge from that. I said, yeah, just go do some market research. You get your MBA, produce some data, nice and simple, do a load of surveys, it's good, it's sort of positivist, it's nice. I didn't know what he meant by positivist, So you'll have the evidence. I said, but no, I really want to do this. So he said, well, if you're going to do it, you've got to write a chapter on epistemology. You're going to have to write a chapter why those case studies aren't just your opinion. What triangulates with them? What's your basis of saying what you're writing is testable and credible, valid overall? I never even knew this. It was on my third degree. He said it's epistemology. So that's what I had to do. So that actually was what got me thinking about, well, what is true? What isn't? Overall, I was in my late 30s, a bit slower than most, but it actually got me thinking about that. from a scriptural point of view, a biblical point of view, for Christians, truth is really important. Yeah? John 18:37, you are a king then, said Pilate. This is Jesus before Pilate, before his crucifixion. You are right in saying I am a king. In fact, it is for this reason I was born. For this I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. What is truth? Says Pilate. A famous biblical passage. And I could give you loads of passages about truth, etc. So I'm going to do a very quick summary of a view of what truth, belief, knowledge is. If on this side here, there's reality. Outside of ourselves, ultimate reality, physical reality, perhaps non-physical realities over here. Over here is what would be a knowledge claim on the other side. And a knowledge claim is something that the classic definition of knowledge is justified true belief. It's true, so it's a knowledge claim that lines up with reality in normal English. It corresponds to reality. That's what lies under what's called the correspondence theory of truth. Yeah? It corresponds to reality. It's a knowledge claim that is, and it's justified. It's justified on evidence. It's not just, well, I want to believe it. Yeah? It's justified. Other definitions, you would use the word warranted. It's a warranted belief. Yeah? So the key questions are, is what is being claimed corresponding to reality, and is there good justification for that? Is there good warrant for that? Yeah. So, truth corresponds to external reality and is internally coherent. Things are as we believe them to be, past, present, and future. So, when it comes to science, methodological naturalism, what is classic science, is a method for finding out of the truth, for knowledge that corresponds to reality, but of physical and material reality. Matter, energy, and space and time. Science, that's what science is. It's a method of finding out the truth about it. It's finding out, knowledge that corresponds to that reality. And it's wonderful. Absolutely amazing. I probably wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for it. I had awfully bad asthma as a young kid. If it hadn't been for the asthma drugs that were available by that time, discovered through science, I probably would have died. Yeah. There's loads of wonderful things we can say science. Science can't be misused, but that's science. Scientism is different. Scientism is a philosophical claim that all that exists is physical and natural. The only things that exist are matter and energy in space and time. There's nothing else. And we'll unpack that a bit more. And we can only know about anything, because that's all that exists, through the application of science. So anything else that isn't science isn't really knowledge. It's just opinions. It's just private thoughts. It's not knowledge. Because how can it be? Because the only thing that exists is matter and energy in space and time. So, if I expand that, both sides there's reality, physical matter, energy, space and time. But what does that mean for other things that seem really real? Real. Soul, spirit. Most of the people in the world do believe in some kind of God. Most would believe there's a soul. What about beauty and love? What is beauty? Is it just something that's a figment of our imagination that's evolved over time, or is there something real there outside of ourselves that is objectively beautiful? I mean, if you stand, people were posting photos of this, those lights, what they call the Aurora Borealis, and saying, wow, it's beautiful. I walked along Whangaparaoa Beach this afternoon and looked out at a beautiful day. Yeah, I've stood on the edge of the Grand Canyon as the sun is rising. Yeah, I remember being on a course in Singapore once and walking out, a group of about 5 people just standing there, silent. It was early morning, not saying anything, and I thought, what are they looking at? Moved over, and there was a peacock with the feathers open, and they were just in awe. Their soul was stirred. It was. Is that just some chemical reaction? Was there some essence there that we would call objective beauty? And what about morals, ethics? Are these just subjective human opinions, human constructs? You know, what's right and wrong, what's fair and unfair, what's just and unjust? Or is there some things that are fair, unfair, just, unjust, right, wrong, good, evil, in all places at all times? Even if you disagree with it. Yeah? Even if you're the last person standing. Yeah? Are there things that are objectively right and wrong? They're not just human opinion. You know? So these would be non-physical realities, if they exist, overall. And what scientism says is that that's all that the reality is, and you know it through the application of science. It's actually not just the application of science. They sneak in something else. Logic and reason. It gets snuck in on the side. Yeah. So all you can know is physical matter, energy, space, and time, and you know it through science, which uses logic and reason. That's all you can know. But what about history? You know, artifacts that are found, writings that are found that we interpret. What about human experience? Experiences I've already talked about. What about the direct intuitions we have, both individually and collectively? Individually ourselves and in tradition and wisdom. And what about the Bible? You know, are these sources for us to understand a bigger view of reality beyond just the physical and the natural? That's essentially what we're talking about here overall. You know? And so we make sense of this reality, and this gets a little bit technical, by reasoning. Yeah? And the reasoning we use is 3 main types. You know, there's deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and abductive reasoning. And I go through this because it sort of sets the scene for the later bit. I can sometimes lose the audience with this bit, so stick with me. But there are 3 types of reasoning overall. Generally, all knowledge flows from evidences, specifics, particulars that we look at. And by looking at them, we generate theories, hypotheses, universal ideas. That's generally what happens. And we do that all the time. As I mentioned, I'm in business on boards. That's what we're doing all the time. Sometimes badly, yeah, because we take evidences, particulars, and then we form views overall. That's what science does by a certain method. Yeah, that's what history does by a certain method. So that's what a court of law does. That's what the jury is doing in a court of law. It's getting all these evidences and reaching general conclusions. So the type of reasonings I'm going to talk about work between the particulars and the general. Yeah? The first type isn't based on evidence. It actually works the other way. The first type of reasoning goes from general, universal to the particular. And that's called deductive reasoning. Logic. Yeah? There are laws of logic that we apply to particulars to make sense of things. Overall. So, you know, deductive reasoning, you know, Sherlock Holmes was a classic for that. But deductive reasoning, if the premises are correct, the conclusions should be absolutely correct. It's probably the only one you would say is certain. Yeah? Universal to particular, applied logic. Now there's laws of logic I'm going to go into, particular laws of logic. You use them intuitively, even if you haven't done a philosophical course in logic. You know, you just use them. You know, and the law of contradiction, excluded middle, and law of identity. And there's fallacies in logic where it's applied badly overall. But this is a quick reasoning, but here's some examples. All bachelors are men. this is actually this example, which is the classic example, could actually be seen as quite controversial in modern times. All bachelors are men. Socrates is a bachelor, therefore Socrates is a man. So there's two premises that you put together to say, well, Socrates is a man. Yep, many of you might have seen that overall. Then on the other side, we've got all reality is physical material. Yeah. Science is the only way to know the physical material world. Therefore, science proves there are no immaterial, non-physical realities. Are you comfortable with that? That second one? What seems wrong about that second piece of deductive logic? Anyone brave enough to? Because you can feel it's wrong, I can tell that. Well, the first statement is an assumption. The premise is an assumption. It's seeking to prove itself. You know, it starts with all reality is physical material. Well, that's a claim, you know. But it's snuck in. That is the underlying premise of scientism, though. That is it. All reality is physical material. Science is the only way we know it. Therefore, science is the only way you can know anything. That's scientism. Well, it actually is falsifiable, the first premise is falsifiable, and that's where I'm going to go. Okay. It's a statement, it's a claim that should be tested. Yeah. Okay, the other two types of reasoning are inductive reasoning and, abductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is the classic reasoning in science. It's really good. It's specific to general, so it takes lots of particulars, and generally the scientific method, you know, looks at lots of particulars and measurements, you know, like facts, and applies an hypothesis to them, often expressed mathematically, you know, and can be tested. That formula can be tested against real world. It has predictive capability. It's repeatable and falsifiable. Yeah? That is the wonderful, you could say, hard science. That's what it does, you know, and it's been an amazing impact on the world since we started really being applied. You know, predictive. That's classic inductive reasoning. Yeah, you okay with that? Abductive reasoning is slightly differently. Abductive reasoning is an inference to the best explanation of certain particulars. And they're particulars that often can't be recreated. Yeah? You know, it goes from particular to general, effect to cause, and it tries to find the best explanation. So all historical work is abductive reasoning. So you take all historical work, you basically find these artifacts, you find these writings, and you try and infer a reasonable explanation. And different historians might say, well, I think this has got more power than that. I think that's got more power than that. So you've got competing hypotheses. And it's the one that's seen as the best explanation. Yeah? Okay with that? Inference the best explanation. Simple example might be the road is wet. You know, if I go out there, I might say, well, that I could reasonably infer it's rained. Well, I might have other, I might look around, and we might see a broken hose pipe overall. You know, so you start to add up the cause and effects. The more particulars you can get to inform your decision, you can become more certain. There's a higher degree of probability that one hypothesis is more correct. But it's not like inductive science. You can't go in a lab and repeat this thing all the time and prove it's right or not overall. Does that make sense? And ultimately, what we all do is cumulatively, we take deductive reasoning, we take inductive reasoning, we use science, and we take abductive reasoning to make sense of things presented to us. Did man land on the moon? You know, I took some of the abductive reasoning with the pictures you can see. You know, you could apply some science to try and understand what the makeup of the rocks that were brought back, reasonably inferring whether they could have come from Earth or not. You know, you could do all that. You know, and then I apply some deduction by saying, well, you know, and the Russians were watching. Yeah? So you're trying to get out what explanation, and there could be competing explanations, has got the most explanatory power, most explanatory scope, is the most plausible, and least ad hoc. Least ad hoc is something that's got no evidence for it, but would explain everything. Okay? Ad hoc would be. So we could all be in a computer program that started 10 minutes ago with all our memories fully loaded. You can't prove that's not true. It's ad hoc. It's a bit. Some people get freaked out by that. I don't believe that's true. But and really, where this all plays out is in a court of law. It plays out constantly in a court of law. You get all the facts, that would come together, and that's why sometimes the phrase jury epistemology is used. There's a guy called J. Warner Wallace. He's an ex-detective a cold case detective in the USA. He's been on TV a lot with cold cases, but he's also an apologist, and he talks about jury epistemology, how all evidences are pulled together and made sense of. So what I'm saying is, from an apologetic point of view, from an assessment of scientism, we've got all these sources of evidence, each of which can get tested. There's science, which is one, and where we're going today is that the only source we can really say can give us knowledge. There's the collective experience and intuitions. There's basic intuitions. There's personal experience. There's history, archaeology, geology, and there's reason and logic, and the center is scripture. The court of law analogy says, most human beings with a reasonable range of IQ can make sense of that. We can weigh things as a jury would do. What I love about the jury analogy is experts are cross-examined. We don't just say, oh, well, experts say that, so they must be right. They're cross-examined, and the experts sometimes disagree overall as well. So, what it isn't is certainty. And that disturbs some people. There's a degree of which you are certain. There's a degree of which you are justified. You justify true belief. A degree in which your belief is justified. It's not certainty in many cases. It's to represent reality the way it really is on the basis of adequate grounds. It has nothing to do with certainty or an anxious quest for it. One can know something without being certain of it. Sometimes what's thrown at Christians is, you got to prove it. But what do you mean by the word prove overall? What do you mean by prove? And the way I often look at it is there's the 10 out of 10s, where you can have a high degree of certainty. Often when I'm speaking in church, I'll say in Scripture, I think this is a 10 out of 10. It's really clearly attested by Scripture. Sometimes there's 7 out of 10s. It seems reasonable. Well attested, but not such a high as a 10. There's reasonable doubt. Under 5 out of 10, you could say. And it's highly doubtful. And taking that analogy of out of 10, if you follow me, and you think about a court of law, even in a court of law, there's a different level of proof required, a different level of justification. In a criminal court, it's beyond reasonable doubt. That's pretty high. Let's call it 8 out of 10. In a civil court or an employment court, it's on the balance of probability. It's 5.1 out of 10. Because I've been involved in business, I've sacked people sometimes. Not something that is always pleasant. But sometimes they'll go away and talk with someone who says, well, they haven't proven it beyond reasonable doubt. Well, I don't need to. It's on the balance of probability. And we see that in civil law. For those of you who are old enough to remember here, O.J. Simpson, who recently died, was found innocent in a criminal court, beyond reasonable doubt. In a civil court, he lost the case with the family of the woman who was killed, on the balance of probability. Does that make sense? So knowledge is justified belief in something. So is the belief in scientism justified? Let's test that. Scientism says the hard sciences alone give us knowledge of reality. Everything else, especially ethics, theology, and philosophy, is at least according to scientism based on private emotions, blind faith, or cultural upbringing. They offer no truth at all. That's by a guy called J.P. Moreland. Yeah? So let's look at that. Is that true? All that exists is physical matter, energy, space, and time, supported by science. So, before we get into that, one last piece of preamble. You know, the logical extension of believing all that exists is matter and energy in space and time is the only thing that can cause anything is matter and energy in space and time. Yeah? There are only physical causes, natural causes allowed. Okay? This is really important. Yeah? So it rules out what's sometimes called agent cause. An agent is, you're an agent. You can decide, you decided to come along tonight. It rules that out. In fact, scientism would say you didn't decide to come along tonight. Because there's no such thing as atoms bouncing around. Somehow the bouncing around led you to being here tonight. The fact you think you had a will to do that is an illusion. Yeah? That's the end reductionist position. All that exists is matter and energy in space and time. Because there is no such thing as a non-physical mind, or it's all physical. Yeah? So agent cause, the purpose for doing something. Yeah? So let me give you a simple example. Yeah? A jug of water. The natural cause, for those of you who've done it in physics, boils, law, and pressure, and heat. The heat applied to the water turned it from liquid to gas. That's the natural cause of the jug boiling. Yeah? The agent cause is Mark turned the jug on. That's the agent cause. The end cause is Mark wanted a cup of tea. It's the purpose. Just making sense. This is really important though, because scientism claims there can only be natural causes. There are no agent causes or end causes ultimately. So, what would refute scientism and say it is a flawed view of reality overall? There's three things I'm going to go through. There's a paper you can have. I've given it to, what did I give it to? Yep. There's paper at the front you can have as well. There's three ways of refuting it. First, it's self-refuting. Second is, if you can identify any non-natural causes in the world, then it refutes scientism. And thirdly, if you can identify even just one non-physical, immaterial, non-material reality, it's refuted. Just one will refute that. So let's quickly go through this. Firstly, it's self-refuting. It's got that circular reasoning I talked about. It seeks to prove what it states. It doesn't actually use evidence for it. Circular reasoning, only physical realities exist. We know physical reality through science, therefore science proves there are only physical realities. That actually proves nothing. It's flawed. The premise is just a statement. It's an assertion. Second reason, it uses logic and numbers, which raises the question, what are the laws of logic and numbers? Are they physical? Well, they're not. They're non-physical realities that seem to be part of the structure of this universe, but they're not energy or matter in space and time. Yeah? What are they then? It raises that question. Science also assumes a theory-independent, orderly, uniform, knowable external world. Yeah? It assumes these things. It doesn't prove them overall. So, questions about it, because things that science uses and claims to be true that science can't prove. Now this can get quite philosophical. People have written a lot on this. There'll be arguments against this, but I think they're powerful arguments to some of the flaws in scientism. Then, are there any non-natural causes of anything evident in the universe? Yeah. with the existence, the best explanation of the evidence is an agent or an end cause rather than natural causes. Well, there's three areas. Firstly, the universe started. This all matter and energy in space and time, and this science points to this. It was a very controversial claim when first made. 1930s was when it started to become generally accepted. At that time, a lot of atheistic scientists used a phrase that it was repellent as a theory, that the universe had a start. So all matter and energy in space and time started. So what caused that? Well, it can't be matter and energy in space and time. So it would appear to point to a non-physical cause. It would appear to point to an incredibly powerful non-physical cause. This non-physical cause is also outside of time. Whatever time is, it's an interesting area. Is outside of time and has a power of volition, as will. Because it's not just cause and effect. There was an agent cause. That sounds a lot like God. What we think of is what we describe as God. All powerful, outside of space and time, that could cause this to happen. And there really is, there's either you believe it just happened, or you take the logical arguments, the cosmological arguments, that there's a non-physical agent cause outside of time that started the universe. It may not be a Christian God, but it sounds a lot like God, a cause to the universe. Then there's the incredible fine-tuning of the universe. Some of you will hear this in other apologetic courses. The incredible just right nature of the universe, the Goldilocks nature of the universe, just right for us to exist now in this time where we are. I'm not going to unpack all this, but statistically, it's so improbable, it's beyond what's called the natural probability bound. The natural probability bound is about 10 to the power 150, I think, where they would say something is impossible in the universe. There's only 10 to the power 80 atoms in the universe. And all calculations would suggest that for everything to be just right, all the physical constants, everything, expansion rate of the universe, everything, for us to exist now, is something like 10 to the power 280, which mean it would be impossible statistically to have happened. Now, arguments come back and says, well, the get-out clause now has become the multiverse theory. Well, if we could have more than one universe, the probabilities change. The problem is there's no real evidence for a multiverse. So and these are not slam dunk. They're cumulative. That's all I'm going. I'm not saying any of these there could be saying, oh well, what about this? What about that? But a possibility is not a probability. You can always say, oh, what about this? Like in a court of law. People defense will sometimes make absurd claims. Now, what about this? Just to plant enough doubt. But this is all about probability, levels of certainty, levels of justification to say, is this how corresponding to the universe? Then there's DNA. Some of you in here work in this field. Specified complex information. The only real source we know of specified complex information is a mind to this degree. DNA discovered in the 1950s. Even when it's talked about like language. And it's incredible, what is the source of that? And then when you look at, the complexity of a single cell, there's been no real plausible naturalistic explanation of how we get the first self-replicating cell with the sheer amount of information, DNA, specified complex information within it. It's powerful. Now it's inference. So do we infer there's a design in mind behind it? Or do we think that, well, it's got to be a natural explanation because that's the only explanation allowed? The scientism position is the latter. That's seeped into the academy and is the academy general position. You couldn't do research on what might be called intelligent design. You'd just be dismissed. You would, in the sense of, not even if you were dismissed from your job, you're just dismissed as being serious for work, you know. So, but it doesn't go away. The problem doesn't go away. Where did this come from? It's either by natural chance, or it points to a design in mind. You know, a simple view, if you walked along Browns Bay and you saw Mark Powell was here written in the sand, you wouldn't, not even the sand, in the rock, you wouldn't say, well, that's an interesting geological formation. You say, that's got information content. The only source we know is a mind. As long as it could take as much wind as there was, it wasn't going to shape the rocks to say that overall. And then there's the irreducible complexity of the whole systems of life. How certain things would have to come together simultaneously, you know, to create the systems of life. Now, there's other people who could talk on this that go on. All I'm saying here is there's powerful evidence from the natural world of which you either need to infer the only cause possible is natural, or does it more powerfully point to an agent cause? What is the most plausible, most powerful explanation overall? And then there's the existence, could you have the existence of one immaterial, non-physical reality? You know, well, we've talked about numbers and logic. I mentioned the soul. Now, there's a lot of evidences that point to the soul. There's our properly basic intuitions, that there's an essence to ourselves. We use it in our general language. The self, the essence. All the atoms in the body have replaced themselves. So who am I? Who's me? If I'm just physical. If all those atoms have been replaced. Where is the continuity? As human beings, we have this deep, properly basic sense of a soul. But there's other arguments. There's a philosophical argument from the law of identity around the arguments of a mind being different to a brain. A brain is being physical, a mind being consciousness. And there's some powerful, I'm not going to go into them, there's powerful arguments that they're not identical. Yeah. A mind is different to a physical brain. And I've talked about out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. Yeah, they need testing. You don't just say, oh, well, we'll accept that. Just a bit like any miracle claim or healing claim. You're not naive. You know, we shouldn't be naive. But there's a substantial body of claims which there's no other possible explanation. There's people who've been on operating theatres who've seen things outside the operating theatre that they just couldn't have seen. You know, people have argued, could it be suggestion, other things, and they've all fallen down. So there's out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences that point to spirit. So there's strong evidence for a soul, for a non-physical reality of the soul. There's strong evidence that would say laws of logic and mathematics are non-physical realities. Then I talked about beauty earlier. You know, the beauty of nature. Dance. You know, what? There's a dance school over there. What's that all about? Every single dance. You know, but it's something beyond just human behavior. There's something about beauty in their art. You know, all these things that point to something that is objectively true. We live and die by them. You know, we treat them as pretty real. So are they just evolved physical behaviors, or are they pointing to something real outside of ourselves that's non-physical, grounded in a creator God? You know, they're serious questions, and this becomes cumulative. None of these, as I said, are slam dunk on their own. You take all these particulars and say, what is the best explanation of all of it? Not just one bit. You can come back and say, oh, well, that could be this and that could be that. But, wow, all civilizations, you know, appreciate beauty. The music, it stirs the soul. We use the language of it, you know. And then I talked about earlier moral and ethical principles. You know, are there moral, ethical realities outside of ourselves, good and evil, fair and unfair, just and unjust, that are objectively real outside of ourselves in all places and all times? And that's a powerful argument that they are. Because number one, those underlying principles are present in all societies. They play out differently often, but the underlying principles are there, you know. And they drive humanity. You know, if you think about the situation in Gaza and Israel at the moment, both sides are claiming that they're just. Same with Russia and Ukraine. It's just, it's fair. You know, all we need to be able to kill someone is to claim it's just. Yeah. And humanity's done some terrible things, which also points to evil as well, as real, not just something that's evolutionarily developed. And with justice comes another thing, which is oughtness, shouldness. There's a power of oughtness, a power of obligation that we deeply feel. And there's a strong argument that points to a source that we're obligated to. It's called the moral argument. And the most powerful thing in humanity being love. You know, we love our children. We'll die for our children if we have them, or grandchildren. Why? If that's not real, that's just chemicals. You know, you could say, I just don't like the consequence. But I think beyond that, it points to something extremely real. So, I've gone on enough. People in the 80s, often philosophers and atheistic philosophers who often were based in scientism and materialism, they tended in the 80s to be quite honest because there hadn't been a rise of really strong apologetics in some areas overall. And they wrote things that like this. Richard, I always get his name wrong, Lewontin or something. Lewontin? Yeah, I always pronounce it wrong. You know, Scientism, a blind ideology, he didn't put the title there. But he said this, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural, the non-physical, you could say. Even the word supernatural can turn people off. Science and the non-natural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories. Just so stories are exactly what that, just so. So, the universe just started, a just so story. The first self-replicating cell just happened, a just so story. Yeah. Because we have a prior commitment to materialism, naturalism. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by an a priori adherence, a prior adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations. No matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated, moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. That, you know, my argument is that scientism is narrow-minded. It is ruling out the possibilities and the exploration of agent cause and end causes. It's losing out the possibility and exploration of non-physical realities as well. And applied in its hardest sense, you know, many things that we happily claim as knowledge should be dismissed, like most historical conclusions we have, because they can't be repeated. We can't bring Napoleon back, you know, and so they can't be subject to some of the hard disciplines that would be argued that they should be overall. So, you know, I think scientism is very different. It's a philosophical stance. It's flawed. It assumes what it seeks to prove, and there are many arguments against it. And if you said, is that the best explanation of this universe and human life, versus, you know, and everything else, or is a Christian theistic explanation a view that there are non-physical realities, that God could exist, a better explanation? You know, I clearly am biased and will go to the latter. The key point for tonight, though, is that scientism creeps into so many things you read in papers and everything else. It's there. You need to be able to spot it, and you need to be able to say, well, is that really science, or is a philosophical position that's driving it? Ultimately, when it comes back to evidences, if I go right back, you know, the reason I'm a Christian theist is when I look at all the evidences, science, reason, logic, history, archaeology, personal experience, basic intuitions, collective intuitions. Firstly, I think they corroborate Scripture, and corroborate the reason I would believe Scripture is true. And they are the best explanation of. Different people would weigh different things as to why they believe. Personally, I come back to basic intuitions and personal experience. Direct encounter with a living God is the ultimate most powerful on a personal level. But the others can remove barriers to people even trying to open their eyes and ears to explore whether they could encounter a living God. And so it is important for these type of things to be thought through and talked about. I'll stop there. I've probably gone on way too long. But I didn't even know how long I was supposed to be speaking for. So I'll stop there. Yeah. All good? Oh. So please, Mark, if you don't mind. No, no. Far away at yep.
Was, if you don't mind sharing, was the out-of-body experience, was that the immediate cause of you coming to the Lord, or was it just part of a series of...
Oh, no, I was a slow learner.
Part of your journey?
I was a slow learner. I didn't grow up in a Christian context. I've never not believed that there was something there. But I think, like a lot of people, I was just busy, and I wasn't born into a Christian family. It didn't. I just went, oh, that was strange. But then again, I wasn't a hard atheist myself. I thought there was something there. I came to faith, in Christian terms, I think God was pulling me, God's Spirit was pulling me all along. In natural terms, I did an alpha course at Whangaparaoa Baptist. But by then, my eyes and ears were open to the possibility more. Whereas up till then, I'd just been busy. And probably my eyes and ears were closed in that sense, to be in. And I think that's often the case,
And did you have people praying for you?
I did actually, yeah. My stepmother, I'm the youngest of five. My parents divorced when I was about 7. My father remarried, and my stepmother on his side was a very strong believer. And she did pray for me all the time. And my wife, she'd been a strong believer, went away to university, drifted away, and didn't become a non-believer, but like a lot of people in their teens, university, drifted away a bit. When our daughters reached about 3 or 4, she started going back to church on a Sunday morning. I was happy to do that as long as she didn't get all weird. She didn't. I go to the gym, she'd go to church. But she was then praying for me, obviously. She had a strong prophetic picture of me speaking on a stage, which fortunately she shared with some non-Christian friends of hers. And they all laughed and said, oh, Vicar Mark. Because she said, oh, I think he's going to be speaking about his faith on a stage. And they thought it was hilarious. And it would have seemed absurd. But she had such a powerful picture of it. And she was so pleased she did share it, even though it seemed, because I'd shown no interest really. And then probably she didn't tell me about it either, until afterwards. But gradually, I know it sounds weird, but that MBA thing started me thinking about, well, what is real? What is truth? I'd never even thought about it. When you do an engineering degree, you learn facts. You don't deal in esoteric things like ethics, and you just learn how to pass your exams. Yeah. And so I never just thought about it, really. But I think I was being drawn. And then we went on a holiday just before we came to New Zealand. I thought, well, I'll read the Bible. She'd been going back to church. So I read the whole of the New Testament on the holiday, read Genesis, stopped at Leviticus. But yeah, it was a in that sense, but it was, yeah.
I'm curious then, when you first read the New Testament, like you weren't a believer then? No. What was it like? Do you remember?
Oh yeah, I mean the Gospels in particular. This guy Jesus was a revelation to me. I mean, he's pretty radical, isn't he? Ignore church and let's be honest, Christian isn't they? You know, and I was, you got to remember, I'm from a very working class South Wales background. So high church, Church of England, there's a lot of context. That's establishment, that's English. If you're English, don't be insulted. You know, you had chapel and church in Wales traditionally, and it was a barrier with that, thinking that was Christianity. Reading the Gospels was, wow, this guy is amazing. You know, the truths is amazing. Paul and some of the epistles, he's a bit of an opinionated guy. You know, I've come to appreciate him a lot more since, obviously, but yeah.
I guess as well, to add on top of that would be, did you ever find some sort of, did you ever have a supernatural encounter whilst reading the scripture that anything has spoken to you personally as you read it? That made you kind of come more to the...
Look, I was drawn. I think I was drawn. Now, is that supernatural? Probably yes. In a sense, I think it's God's, I would say God's Spirit drawing. Because, you know, when we then emigrated here, you know, I was willing to go and do that Alpha course, you know, and willing to go along to church. And I'd never really been in church, you know, and I thought you'd turn up there and there'd be some guy in a funny thing with a dog collar and stuff like that, because that's what I thought church was. And they were playing music, and it was quite contemporary, and they seemed like reasonably nice people. So I was being drawn, I think, because yeah. But the Gospels, particularly John in particular, really, wow, this is incredible. Yeah.
Why does science say that the universe had to have a beginning?
Well, the evidence, the expansion of the universe, is, you know, the rate of expansion of the universe, all points to a single point of a start. And, you know, that was radical, because up until that was validated, there'd generally been a view in a steady state universe. It had always been there. So this pointing to a start lined up with scripture. You know, and there's a writer, there's a philosopher of science who did a book on this. He's not a Christian, can't remember his name now. And he said, it was like all these scientists climbing to the top of the mountain and finding these theologians that were already sitting there. Because, you know, it's Genesis, isn't it? You know, there was a start. And so, you know, the measurements of the universe with predictive capability, you know, and it's been tested back an original start. You know, yeah. So, yeah. Now it's not laboratory type inductive science. It's observing the universe and then predicting what you would find and then finding it. You know, as the universe is observed. Yeah. Yeah. Einstein was critical in that process.
I just had one too. So, in your line of work, have you run into this scientism in some more of a corporate board sort of environment? I don't know.
Not so much scientism, but the aspect of what is reasonable to believe, what's reasonable to infer, how do you weigh evidences, is there all the time in every conversation. You know, it's because this doesn't just apply, you know, this is a particular thing around scientism, you know, but the general about, well, how do you reach conclusions that are well informed? Well, a lot of boards don't reach conclusions that are well informed. They buy narratives and they fit the facts for the narrative. They judge people. I mean, a lot of this is relational as well. You know, how we interpret an individual, you know, can be true or untrue. You know? And so boards can make very superficial judgments on people with evidence. And so I'll often find myself saying, well, what are we basing this on? Does somebody give a poor presentation to a board? Does that make them a bad leader? I'm not so sure. Yeah, and so, you know, the general application of epistemology, you know, how do you reach conclusions, that you would claim to know things, applies on everything. It applies in boardrooms, it applies to things you read in the newspapers, it applies to relationships. You know, when somebody says, this person has done that X or is thinking that. Well, that's your interpretation. How do you know that? Is that being stirred up by your feelings? Yeah. So it moves it, this whole aspect of epistemology. What do we claim to know? Is it justified? It applies everywhere, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'd say that as a researcher, I see similar behaviors toward some researchers can be quite idiosyncratic, and some of the personalities they may give a terrible presentation, but they may be brilliant researchers.
Yeah.
You're not always able to tick all the boxes to please some sort of review board or something.
And I mean, because I've worked in retail, wholesale, logistics, and they're businesses that often the frontline people can know a lot of things, but they don't express them well. They might have intuitive knowledge, just etc. And you get somebody who's well qualified coming across the top. Maybe can give great PowerPoint, etc. But that knowledge is real. You just got to draw it out, Or they may give poor presentations. I had a particular executive to me who, every time he presented to a board, he fell apart. But he was a great executive with his team. He was just in front of, but the way the board perceived that person, in my view, was a false perception. And this applies to biblical. All this again applies to biblical interpretation. What do we claim to know well? What should we hold a bit more lightly and be a bit more spacious? What is fun but speculative theology, based on a couple of bits? But there's two equal and opposite errors. There's everything being too narrow and got to be absolutely certain, even if the evidence isn't strong, which is one way. And then the other way, which is the liberal way, there's no bounds, everything just falls out. You can't know anything. I mean, sometimes with this talk I'll do a comparison with postmodernism, which sort of goes the other way. Postmodernism is basically a knowledge claim that we can't know anything other than our own subjective personal views. And we see this playing out probably more clearly now in this whole transgender debate, where some old school atheistic scientists like Richard Dawkins are most upset because biology says you're a woman, and postmodern thinking, well, it's my truth. If I feel this way, it must be true. So they're all claims about knowledge and epistemology, and even within biblical interpretation, you get extreme. Well, there are no bounds; you can't know anything. And you get overly narrow, you could say fundamentalism. Well, I use that word carefully because the original fundamentals I would probably sign up to back from the 1920s, and when anything but narrow, But there are things we can, what are the essentials of the faith, highly attested in Scripture, that most Orthodox Christians would agree on. I'm in a different group of churches to what I'm in today, but we'd probably agree on all those. Then there's the things where we'll have some spaciousness. What I find interesting about most really liberal theology is it's scraps of speculation that aren't based on anything. It's quite interesting. But it's all knowledge claims. It's all knowledge claims.
Like you were saying how it's like they just want it so badly.
Yeah. And I can understand that. I'm not dismissing that. We've got to, what is love? I think love is grace and truth. Held together tightly. Grace, thank God God has got grace for us. Because we're all flawed human beings. And I'm sure I'll find out, there's lots of things I probably got wrong. But grace with truth that's for the best of others, not just because you want to be right, that's in line with wanting human flourishing, is love. It's like your kids, isn't it? You enforce certain truths because you love them. You want the best for them. You don't say, go do heroin. It's all good fun. Don't worry. It's your free choice.
With the whole theory of evolution and the evidences that they have, would that then fall under abductive or inductive?
Most of it would be abductive, because it's looking back. I did geology because I did mining, and you know, geology is a study of past things. You look at the present now. Now, there are scientific aspects that are brought in. You know, how much pressure would it take for those rocks to have formed? You can apply scientific physics to that. But a lot of it is abductive reasoning. It's inference to an explanation for things that you see. Most paleontology, I would argue, is abductive reasoning. Yeah. I still remember, and I was way before I was a Christian, doing my geology A-level, and writing an essay on the evolution of graptolites, which I didn't believe any of it, because, you know, basically you had a graptolite 10 million years earlier and and a different shaped graptolite 10 million years later. I don't know what it proved, you know. But it's abductive reasoning, largely. You know, it's inferring an explanation. The question is it the best explanation? But even, it's interesting you bring the evolution up. You know, the essential to me is the evidence for cause and design in the universe. How that played out is not as well, I don't believe, is as well evidenced. Scripture it could be controversial here. You know, was it 6 days? Was it 15 billion years? Was there elements of evolutionary change, and some elements of what might be called theistic evolution, I think, drift into being Darwinian evolution, yeah, at the far edge. But I'm happy to sit with anyone there and chat, yeah, because the key thing to me is God made, God created. You know, I have a view, but I don't hold it as a title. I hold it at about a 6 out of 10, whereas the cause and design I hold at a 9 or 10, a 10 out of 10, actually, you know, from both the revelation of the scripture, which was then later proven, you could argue, or corroborated by the science, that there was a start. I think that's amazing. We sort of just shrug our shoulders at that now, but it was an incredible discovery. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, any last questions before we wrap up?
We have printouts of his essay that you can take with you at your read at your pleasure.
Oh, before I forget, so that essay is on the Thinking Matters website. I don't know if you've heard of Thinking Matters. I'll give them a bit of a plug. They got their conference coming up in August.
Is it in August?
It's in August. Where's my phone? I'll tell you the date now.
Yeah, we were supposed to have Josh King here today.
Yeah, he contacted me. His kid wasn't well.
Oh, okay.
And so he's done the right thing and stayed with his kid.
Yeah, he's a good dad.
I'll tell you the date now. It's August sometime. And it's down at, what's the name of the church? The one that's just off the, no, not Victory. C3 Church in Ellerslie. You can see from the motorway.
Also, you can just Google Thinking Matters NZ.
Yeah.
Sure.
It's on the 24th and 25th of August, and it's got Greg Kuchel.
Oh, okay.
So Greg Kuchel, for those who won't be aware, Greg Kuchel runs an organization called Stand to Reason in the USA. And Greg talks a lot about conversational apologetics. You know, those two questions I put up at the beginning. Because as Christians, you know, often, you know, the argument might, oh, you got to prove what you believe, etc. That's the wrong slide. Oh, I've closed it. There you go. That was what I wanted. Greg's whole view is he writes a book called Tactics, which sounds a bit, I don't like the word tactic, but it basically says, look, when you get in a conversation, just firstly try and understand what the other person believes. What do you believe? How have you come to that conclusion? Why would you believe that? You haven't got to always try and defend Christianity. You haven't got to always try and convert everyone the first time you meet with them. Try and understand where the other person's coming from first. It's a conversation. That's all it is. And they may have questions for you. Yeah? And you may find some things they ask you uncomfortable, because they may say, well, why have you come to that conclusion? You may go, oh, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. Yeah? But it should be just a conversation. And he's really good, great speaker. So he's over from the USA. So that'd be good.
They're pretty big in the States.
Yeah, very big. So yeah, that's August 24th, 25th. Anyway, sorry, I got diverted there.
Other speakers, you know.
Yeah, loads of other speakers. Yeah.